Washington responds to Beijing's top diplomat. The Chinese official earlier laid out red lines it says the U.S. can't cross when dealing with the communist regime. Canadian lawmakers passed resolutions accusing Beijing of genocide against the Uyghur ethnic minority, but Trudeau's administration is not supporting the resolution. Hundreds of British schools could become outlets for Chinese propaganda. That's as Chinese companies linked to the CCP look to buy them. Calls to boycott the 2022 Beijing Olympics are growing because of China's poor human rights record. The US, UK, Canada, and Australia are among those supporting the movement. And the daughter of a top Communist Party leader recounts her family's suffering. Her father served as the secretary to Communist leader Mao Zedong. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. We reported yesterday that a top Chinese diplomat acted tough on the Biden administration. Here's how the State Department is responding. NTD's Juliet Song has the details.
Heard my name invoked.
The State Department is responding to a warning from Beijing. On Monday, Beijing's top diplomat listed several red lines he says the U.S. shouldn't cross if it were to engage in dialogues with the Chinese regime.
I think his comments reflect a continued pattern of Beijing's tendency to avert blame for its predatory economic practices, its lack of transparency, its failure to honor its international agreements, and its repression of universal human rights.
The Chinese foreign minister says the regime wants to reset its relationship with the U.S., but only under several conditions. One being that the U.S. must stop criticizing China's human rights record in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. Beijing is also calling on the Biden administration to lift Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods and remove sanctions on Chinese tech companies. But the State Department disagrees.
We'll continue to stand up for our democratic values when human rights are being violated in Xinjiang, Tibet, or elsewhere in China, or when autonomy is being trampled in Hong Kong.
The State Department also adds that the U.S. would approach the Chinese regime from a position of strength.
We will work closely with our allies and partners across the board. That's precisely what we're doing with the Quad. It's precisely what we're doing with our allies and partners in Europe. It's precisely what we're doing with our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific to approach China from a position of strength.
The White House also reacted to Beijing's demands on the same day. It says the U.S.-China relationship is one of strong competition, and the administration would work with allies on China issues. Juliet Song, NTD News.
After Beijing pressed Biden to reverse Trump's China policies, former China policy advisor to then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says Beijing has no logic in saying such a thing. Miles Yu tells Radio Free Asia that the CCP is not just facing conflicts with the U.S., it's also having trouble with the rest of the world, such as its neighbors and European countries. He says the CCP has, quote, no sincere friends. Therefore, it doesn't make sense to single out the U.S. The CCP's ambassador to the U.S. said recently that Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Xinjiang issues are red lines for Beijing. Yu responds by saying the CCP has already crossed the red lines on these issues. It has no bottom line and does not hesitate to do whatever it wants. He says, Yu also responds to the CCT narrative that other countries have no right to interfere in what it calls domestic issues. He explains that the CCP's mass theft of U.S. commercial secrets, its efforts to prevent the international community from investigating the origins of the virus, and its suppression of the pro-democracy activists outside of China are not the regime's domestic issues. Yu also emphasizes, quote, if the Chinese regime wants to be respected by others, it must first respect basic international laws. The Chinese regime is talking about mutual respect now because it wants the international community to turn a blind eye when it's violating international norms. He then says the CCP's behavior is just like a thief acting like a cop. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is showing her support for pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong. Among them, she singled out prominent democracy leader Martin Lee. Lee is in the middle of a trial now. In a statement, Pelosi called Lee an embodiment of courage and principle, and that the trial of Lee and other activists sends the chilling message that Beijing will stop at nothing in its crackdown on the rights and freedoms of Hong Kong. Lee is known as Hong Kong's father of freedom, and he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize earlier this year. He's also a barrister and senior politician. Hong Kong authorities charged Lee and other pro-democracy leaders for participating in a rally in 2019. Pelosi says when it comes to holding China accountable for human rights abuses, the U.S. Congress has bipartisan support, and the U.S. must make sure that those who are persecuted by Beijing know that they haven't been forgotten. She adds the Chinese government must know that the world is watching its strangulation of human rights. And if the U.S. does not speak out clearly for human rights in China because of commercial interests, it loses all moral authority to speak out for human rights any place in the world. Canadian lawmakers are accusing China of genocide. Politicians of all major parties backed the non-binding resolution and passed it overwhelmingly on Monday. It says China has committed genocide against Muslims, including the Uyghurs who live in Xinjiang. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's administration is not supporting the resolution, saying more investigation is needed. The U.S. State Department estimates China has tortured or otherwise mistreated more than 1 million ethnic minority Uyghurs in detention camps. The European Union Foreign Policy Chief is calling on the Chinese regime to allow the UN Human Rights Commissioner to visit Xinjiang and Tibet in order to investigate the mistreatment of Muslim Uyghurs and Tibetans living in the two regions.
Once again, we urge China to allow meaningful access to Xinjiang for independent observers, including High Commissioner Bachelet.
The foreign policy chief says this is key to enabling an independent assessment of the international community's grave concerns. Disruptions are brewing in the fashion industry as supply chain problems grow like never before in recent history. Nike, H&M, The Gap, Old Navy, and other fashion outlets are shifting their cotton sources out of China's Xinjiang region. President of the Taiwan Textile Federation, Justin Huang, says that's because Western brands no longer want Chinese cotton. This after the U.S. banned imports of cotton products produced in Xinjiang. The U.S. sanctions were prompted by Beijing's abuse of the Uyghur ethnic minority. Some Uyghurs detained in Xinjiang labor camps have said they were tortured and forced to work in textile factories. The ban applies to products made in whole or in part with Xinjiang cotton. Vice President of the American Apparel and Footwear Association, Nate Herman, said that American fashion brands are working hard to remove Xinjiang cotton from their supply chains. Nike has since confirmed its suppliers are not using textile products from Xinjiang. The Gap, Old Navy, and Banana Republic say they've banned suppliers from sourcing products from Xinjiang, directly or indirectly. Same goes for H&M and furniture company IKEA. Last month's ban has affected over 80% of cotton production in China. Hundreds of British schools could be in danger of becoming propaganda outlets for the Chinese Communist Party. That's as schools are in financial crisis due to the pandemic, and Chinese companies are looking to buy them. NTD's Don Ma has more on the story.
Hundreds of British schools are in danger of being bought by Chinese companies linked to the Chinese Communist Party or its military. The pandemic has left British private schools in a dire financial situation. Experts anticipate a feeding frenzy of purchases by firms, some of which are run by high-ranking members of the CCP. The acquisitions would expand the CCP's influence over Britain's education system. British newspaper The Mail on Sunday reports there are currently 17 British schools owned by Chinese companies. That number is expected to skyrocket. 9 of those companies are run by senior CCP members. Even before the pandemic, Chinese companies were acquiring British schools. Some of the campuses already use state-censored versions of content about China in their curriculum. As seen from Beijing's Confucius Institutes, these versions claim there's only one China, and that Taiwan is a renegade province of the mainland. They also mask human rights abuses, including those directed toward the Uyghur ethnic minority, and conceal the crackdown on Hong Kong's freedoms. A professor from the University of South Carolina Icahn Business School tells us that the situation is a concerning one for future generations.
The CCP will definitely control the content being taught. It will also bring its system of brainwashing into the schools. Slowly, the CCP's ideology will be imported into Western society, and the younger generation will grow up to welcome and support the CCP more and more.
One Chinese company openly said that its acquisition of British schools is aimed at supporting China's controversial Belt and Road Initiative. It refers to an infrastructure project heavily criticized for trapping developing countries under heavy debt and using that to expand Beijing's control overseas. On its website, it details plans to use its British schools to help boost China's global economic and political influence. This by helping expand Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative to other countries. A key player in the school purchases is the Bright Scholar Company. It's owned by the daughter of Yang Guoqiang, a high-ranking member of the CCP's Advisory Council. That's one of the regime's most important organs. Bright Scholar already owns 4 British schools. Another player is Chinese company Wanda Group. Its owner, Wang Jianlin, is also on the CCP's Advisory Council and previously served in China's People's Liberation Army as a soldier. Wanda Group also owns 2 British private schools. The pandemic has made it even easier for Chinese firms to buy private schools in Britain, thanks to the sector's severe lack of funding. Enrollments have plummeted and fees have been slashed as pupils attend class from home. British boarding schools have reportedly seen fees fall by up to 35%. Reporting by NTD's Don Ma.
Now we turn to a Chinese researcher in California. The Department of Justice is charging Chen Song with visa fraud. She conducted studies on brain diseases at Stanford University, but prosecutors allege she's secretly a member of the Chinese military. On her visa application, Song says she works for a Chinese hospital. But according to the indictment, Song lied to the FBI about her links to the military and that she has been deleting related information after she learned about the FBI's interest in her. Song's trial is set to begin in April. She could face up to 20 years in prison if found guilty. A new report finds that Chinese spies are using code developed by the U.S. National Security Agency. They use the code for hacking operations.
An Israeli-based software company says that some features of a Chinese malware are so similar to ones developed by the National Security Agency, or NSA, they could only have been stolen from a set of leaked plans. Researchers at Checkpoint Software Technologies believe the Chinese malware uses NSA code leaked to the internet in 2017. Back in 2016 and 2017, a mysterious group of hackers released some of the NSA's most dangerous code. This allowed cybercriminals and rival nations to use U.S.-made digital break-in tools to their own advantage. Governments around the world make malware to take advantage of flaws in their rivals' software. Every time spies discover a new flaw, they must decide whether to quietly exploit it or fix the issue to stop their rivals or rogue hackers. This new report suggests that malware or break-in tools developed by governments can be used against them.
A U.S. House resolution says China shouldn't be rewarded for its inhumanity. It comes amid growing calls worldwide for a boycott of the 2022 Beijing Olympics. The new resolution was introduced last week by Florida Congressman Michael Waltz. It urges the U.S. Olympic Committee to move the hosting site to another country. If that's rejected, then it states the United States should withdraw from the Games. He said the Chinese regime has, quote, carried out a number of heinous acts in the last year alone that should disqualify them from hosting the 2022 Winter Olympics. He pointed to the regime's atrocities against the Uyghur ethnic minority in China's Xinjiang region, something the United States has designated as genocide. He also mentioned Beijing's crackdown on Hong Kong and its cover-up of the CCP virus outbreak. Alongside Waltz, 7 other U.S. senators have called for the Games' host city to be changed. Following in the U.S.'s footsteps, Canada's main opposition party urged the government to pressure the Olympic Committee to move the 2022 Winter Olympics as well. The British Parliament and Australia are also pushing to do the same. He was among the first to join the Chinese Communist Party, among the first to be persecuted by it, and among the first to realize its true nature. In this exclusive interview, the daughter of a senior CCP member recounted her and her father's journey toward finding out the truth about the Communist Party.
What does it feel like when an ideal you have dedicated your life into turns out to be a lie? In an interview with NTD's Chinese language program Focus Talk, Li Nanyang, the daughter of Mao Zedong's personal secretary, shared how she changed her view on the Chinese Communist Party. The change came through painful life experiences and reflection. Li's father, Li Rui, was one of the Communist Party's most senior members. But all that changed when he criticized Mao for his responsibility in the catastrophic Great Leap Forward. The political movement caused a widespread famine that killed more than 35 million Chinese people. Li's critique got him expelled from the party and thrown in prison. He spent 8 years in solitary confinement. After Mao's death, Li went back to the party's central power circle, but he was again suppressed. That's after he urgently called on the CCP not to use military force against the unarmed Tiananmen Square student protesters in 1989. The same incident that for the first time made his daughter question her belief in the CCP. She was working in Central America at the time.
So when I first heard and read about the Tiananmen Square incident, it was through Western media, and it was extremely shocking, and I could not accept that this was happening. The CCP has persecuted my family for years, and my father spent 20 years in prison. Nonetheless, I still felt passionate about my country and wanted to make a difference. But I could not tolerate the CCP's slaughtering of my fellow countrymen. So I called an American engineer I knew, and I told him I no longer wanted to work for the CCP, and asked him if he could find me a job in the U.S.
Li went to work at Stanford University and later the University of California, Berkeley as an engineer. That's when she started sorting through her father's diary and other records of the CCP's early history, gradually gaining more understanding of the big picture.
I remember going through the pile, and I found a letter from my mother to my father. It was very romantic. This was shocking to me because I didn't know my mother once cared for him so deeply. All I knew was they were politically at each other's throat, and my mother used to tell me that my father was an irredeemable enemy.
When Li's father was being persecuted, her mother feared she would also be implicated. In order to win authorities' trust and avoid punishment, she reported many of her husband's so-called misdeeds to the party.
After I read my parents' letters and diaries, I was very shocked. I started to understand why parents turned on one another later on. The communist revolution took away their human emotion and humanity.
Li also learned about the Communist Party's history of killing.
When I went through my father's work notes, it completely creeped me out. The Communist Party killed countless people. At the beginning, they killed their own people. During its anti-Bolshevik period, the CCP was just established. It put people against each other. And later, during land reform, they were basically slaughtering people. They didn't care about human lives in the least. Even Hu Yaobang, someone who was considered good among the CCP, said we had to kill them to deal with people's anger. Their world revolves around the single word kill.
Li said a lot of research in the West about the Communist Party often resembles archaeology and lacks perspective on how the regime operates.
They pick a narrow subject and start digging. If I may be impolite, for many researchers, it is about completing their PhD thesis or getting offered a teaching position. What they fail to see is that for those of us who know what it's like living under a communist regime, our hatred for the system runs deep because it has caused us unspeakable suffering.
She said people should study with the hope that the same tragedies will not repeat themselves, and advocate against the West's entanglement with Beijing.
You will be changed by it. It's the same as mingling clear water and muddy water. After coming in contact with the muddy water, the clear water will become muddy. You will no longer be clear. I think this is something the socialists in the West failed to understand.
Her father passed away in Beijing in 2019. Against his wishes, the CCP buried him in a cemetery reserved for high-ranking communists. With the communist red flag on his coffin, his daughter boycotted the event to no avail. In an interview with the BBC in 2017, Li explained the reasoning behind his hard life choices.
Penny
Zhou, NTD News.
The CCP claims that nobody is poor in China, but this claim is making lives even harder for the low-income people in China. Beijing closed its Office for Poverty Alleviation and replaced it with a newly established organ called the National Bureau of Rural Revitalization earlier last week. The reason for the new move is that, as the CCP claims, China is free of poverty, so the Office for Poverty Alleviation is no longer needed. China affairs expert Dong Li-Wen from Taiwan's Taiwan think tank tells the Epoch Times that with the Office for Poverty Alleviation closed, low-income households won't be considered poor by the CCP, and all poverty relief aid will be cut off. He also mentions that charitable organizations in the world regularly provide assistance to the poor. But now, as there are officially no poor households in China anymore, low-income Chinese people cannot receive any international aid either. There are around 800 million farmers in China. But why are so many of them in poverty? Dong believes that underinvestment is one of the main reasons. He says the CCP has moved most of its funds to the technology industry, as well as the 5G industry, and it does not regard agriculture as a key investment area. Another reason has to do with the political system. Dong says whenever an economic budget becomes available for farmers, officials at all levels squeeze it harshly and take some for themselves. As a result, very few can reach the farmers in the end. In addition, conflicts between authorities and farmers arising from land disputes and forced demolitions are occurring more frequently, making farmers' lives more difficult. Compared to people living in Chinese cities, people from rural areas are considered second-class citizens with little to no health insurance and pensions. They also enjoy almost no freedom of migration to Chinese cities. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow. Hi, we're happy to announce that you can also catch us on cable TV now. Millions of households already choose us as one of their trusted news sources, and you can too. You can watch us in Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York, and many other cities as well. And if your system doesn't carry NTD yet, you can just give them a quick call and request NTD on your cable provider. Thank you for watching. See you next time.